My work did. So we moved here for a job, and so it was pretty quick. You know, we had to find a school quickly, but no excuses. We thought we had picked a great school.
Correct. We moved into the area in August of 2016, and we were looking for the best school for our children. And we have moved many times over the years, and so we wanted to make sure that we provided a good foundation for our students. We wanted a school that was diverse and inclusive, and University School of Milwaukee comes up when you Google the best school in the area. So that's why we chose it.
At the onset of COVID, right at our 11 and 9-year-old were virtual learners because they stayed home, and we weren't going to risk anything. And so that allowed us to look into the classroom, and what we saw was a repeated use of racial and ethnic stereotypes in actual school assignments. And then there was also a disregard for children who were not physically present in the classroom. And then thirdly, there was an insensitivity to socioeconomic status. And we raised these concerns, and we used the word bias, but it wasn't like, okay, you guys got to fix this or we're out of here. We were like, well, here, we're happy to kind of help you work with you through these issues. You know, because it was during the time when folks were trying to understand the whole George Floyd situation, Black Lives Matter. So we are willing advocates for working together to avoid certain bias situations. And once we raised our concerns, they summarily dismissed our 11 and 9-year-old. But once the community heard that our kids got kicked out, we heard from a number of people and realized that our situation wasn't unique, and that this was a pattern of behavior. And once we heard that, then we felt a responsibility to do something more, because we would feel awful if we just packed up and left and left other families holding the bag. And so that was why we brought the lawsuit.
Well, what I will say is we did witness racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic biases, but the real egregious behavior here was how they reacted to when we raised the concerns. So I don't know that we want to get into the actual concerns, but like Craig mentioned, we partnered with the head of school. He asked us to share our concerns and our observations, and he called this a partnership. So we had phone calls, we were on Zoom with him and other families of students who were learning from home. And we gave him feedback during these calls, and he was receptive, and we kept plugging along, and he appreciated the information we shared, so much so that on one call, he told me that I should be on his payroll for all the work that I was doing, as well as I had given him his marching orders for the next 5 years, because he was new to the University School of Milwaukee, and he would not have had this insight. We had a bird's eye view into our children's learning. We never expected to have to pay such close attention to that, particularly for our 5th grader. But when you hear things, you listen closer. And so we shared concerns, we brought him observations, and then, he also had said, I'll use your ideas, but I'll never give you credit. And while we weren't concerned about that, we never expected that this would be turned on us in a retaliatory form that it was. What I will say is that they have a bias reporting system that they established last year. When we noticed bias, we decided we were going to report that. Upon my first report, I was told that the reporting system wasn't working. I then shared the report with the head of school, who then challenged me on whether or not it was a bias. And then the second time we put in a bias report, it was shortly after then that our son was dismissed through a letter. And what I would also note is that bias reporting system no longer exists at the University School of Milwaukee. We were trying to figure that out ourselves because we received a letter that said that our fifth grader would not be allowed to return the following semester. And we wondered how one student could be dismissed and the other was allowed to stay.
Or why would we send
another
child there if you don't want?
And the interesting point of all of this is I was a very active parent, and I had been in the school when the students were in school live. I have always helped and supported teachers. I was a very active member of the Parents Association. I was on committees. We were known. We were a known entity in the school. So when you dismissed one of our children, it raised a question for us, like, well, so does that mean I still get to come back to school next year and be my student's room parent, my fourth grader? And how does that work? And I don't think it was until that point that they realized they hadn't thought that through. And so then they ultimately dismissed our other child. But what we learned through talking to other families is this is not unique. This has happened. And one thing that they have done to other families is they will say one child's, either one child can't come back, the other one can, or the parents aren't allowed on campus, but the kids are allowed to remain in school. That's an interesting question because I learned in early spring that there was there had been a math test in previous years that fifth graders could take to pass out of sixth grade math. So they would essentially be going into seventh grade math. And because at that point, and still to this day, my student, our son, was receiving straight A's. And I was actually working with him all year at home doing math. And so I inquired about this math test, and the head of school did not know about it. Understandably, he was new to the school. So we kept inquiring and still received no information. So in our last phone conversation with the head of school, we said, could you please get us the information about this math test? And he said, oh yes, I'll give you a call back in 2 days. I'll give you that information, which interestingly enough, at the same time, we had asked him if he could also make sure that the head and the assistant head of the middle school would have a conversation with us because they were unwilling to communicate with us throughout the year. And he said, I will get that information back to you as well. So we had a great conversation. We ended it. He was going to send us an email the next day to follow up, which he did. He followed up in an email the next day. Here's some information that you requested, not about the math test, but during our conversation. And then this 48 hours later, we received, I was on the phone with him, and at which point he said that the head and the assistant head of the middle school were unwilling to reconcile with us, which we didn't realize we had any issues to begin with. And I said, okay, well, can I please still know about this math test so I can make some decisions for my son going forward? And he said, actually, I can make that decision for you. And so that was the end, essentially, and then the letter to follow. But what we realized at that point was he was unwilling to share who had access to this math test. And what we have learned along the way is that perhaps not everyone was able to take this test.
I think that you could apply that one to everybody, right? It may just be that the rich majority kids get to take this test and everybody else doesn't. We won't know because
they never shared
it.
And I pushed a few times, and perhaps some of that pushing caused that at the end. We don't know, but we should have been given that information because I asked for that. But we do know it's not a test that all students took.
Okay.
But these are normal questions that you would ask as a parent, right? And not expect to have your child expelled for it. So
for asking.
While we're still trying to process all of this, the community reaches out to us I can't believe they did this to you, but I'm not surprised because this happened to us.
In fact, someone called this a fraternity. They said, "Welcome to the fraternity. There are a number of us." And I had no idea.
And we're here to tell you, there are people of all sort of nationalities and races who are in this group, but the predominant number of folks are people of color.
Our sons did not experience that directly, but those are stories that we heard from other families after ours.
But I will say those types of stories happened at the school while our sons were there. So it does affect your kids, right? Maybe not personally, but it affects their.
And they knew, at least our fifth grader knew, that there have been students within his grade even who have used the N-word. They're thriving and they're in a very supportive environment, but they're the ones that took the brunt of the pain when the University School of Milwaukee told them they were no longer welcome there. And as you can imagine, they were 9 and 11, and they were displaced from an academic community and deprived of friendships and relationships with teachers that they had established over the 5 years. So it was very hard for them, and they were stigmatized by people who assumed they must have done something terribly wrong, which obviously could not be further from the truth. And the University of the School of Milwaukee put us in a painful position trying to explain to our young boys why they were no longer able to attend this school, that the only school that they knew since we first moved to Wisconsin. And I would say it's been heartbreaking to watch them manage this, and especially a school who tells kids to relate to one another with respect and honesty and kindness and truth and fairness. And they wonder, like, well, what more could we have done? These were the things we were doing. We were A students. We were portraits of a graduate as described in the letter of dismissal. And yet they knew that community members and even their peers were saying, what did they do that was so bad that got them thrown out of school? Recently, our older son, had experienced some racism, and it happened multiple occasions. And it wasn't until the third time that he came to share this with us in tears. And he said, I said, why hadn't you told us? And he said, well, I didn't want to say anything because I didn't want to get in trouble. And so there's a pain as a parent when your child is afraid to say that something like that is bothering them because they know they've been retaliated against in the past.
Yeah, what I would say is whether they would be supportive or not, this is kind of what parenting is. So you're teaching your kids how to advocate for themselves. And the way we look at it is, everybody talks about the talk that families have to have with their Black kids in dealing with the law enforcement and getting pulled over. Well, now our kids, we have to teach them how to talk to people in the education system, because the same things happen in a place that you normally would consider a safe space for children.
Well, I think accountability is number one, and we don't want them to do this to anyone else. And they need to diversify the school board, administration, faculty, conduct racial sensitivity training to faculty, administrators, and students, and hire culturally competent faculty and administrators, and dedicate funding efforts to support students of underrepresented groups. But there is also a study called the AIM study, which is the assessment of inclusivity and multiculturalism. And they did that study last year. And by the time we had left in June, they'd still not shared the results of that study. And it is important that they share the results of their climate study so they can give feedback on the inclusiveness of the school community.